What's up, everybody? This is your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga, here to bring you another video with no frills, just the analysis. And today I'm going to be bringing you the Season 5, Episode 4 review of Breaking Bad entitled 51. Alright, so before I get into this, let me just say that this episode again continues the great characterization that we've seen not just throughout the Breaking Bad series, but throughout the first 4 episodes of this fifth season. And it's just been absolutely excellent. I mean, I can't praise the characterization, especially the continued, like I alluded to in my last review, the continued transformation of Walter White as a character, and basically the way he has descended more into his God complex and more into his own narcissism, and the ways in which he's been committed to his delusional fantasies of his own power, basically. And so that characterization can just continues to be excellent. And again, just like the last episode, there's continued focus on Walter White as a character rather than the secondary characters around him. Although in this episode we do get the finally, which everybody probably could have anticipated, the antagonism, the real growing antagonism between Walter White and his wife Skylar White. And in this episode in particular, it was more character driven rather than plot driven. And I suspect that as this season approaches its finale, we'll get more and more plot as the season progresses. So now let me just jump into what it was that this episode was about. So this episode was about two things. The first is the criminal aspect, which was Hank's continuing investigation of the remnants of Gus Fring's criminal enterprise. And the second thing, which I've already alluded to a little bit, is again the continued transformation of Walter White's character, and also the sort of, now since we've this antagonism between Walter and Skylar has come to the forefront, the sort of mental deterioration of Skylar White because of the pressure that she's going through and having to deal with Walter, who's now just become a sort of despot over his own family, which is really sickening to see. And I must say that, of course, I'm rooting for Skylar against Walter. And in all honesty, I can't imagine that there are people out there who not who agree with what Walter White is doing. Because I know that there are some people who will probably still like Walter White as a character, but from in just an objective sense, I don't think anybody can be rooting for Walter White in this story. Not anymore. I mean, he's really turned out to be the major villain of this narrative. So, as the title suggests, 51, this is an allusion to Walter White's 51st birthday. And so this sort of serves, his birthday sort of serves as a context, or a sort of symbolic context for Walter White's narcissism. Because a birthday, when you think about it, is a celebration of somebody's life, a celebration, not a glorification, but in some ways it is sort of a glorification that this person is 1 year older, that they're wiser, and that, you know, we're celebrating their life. And so this symbolism of a birthday as the celebration of somebody's wife, not wife, of somebody's life, sort of serves as a way to give the viewer some insight into Walter's growing narcissism. So there's this sort of congruence between the celebration of Walter White and how this celebration of Walter White feeds into his growing narcissism. And just like I said before in my last episode review, now I'm pretty much convinced that Walter White is suffering from what might be called narcissistic personality disorder. And this narcissistic personality disorder at this point looks like it's fully evolved into what we might call a God complex, which is a person who's obsessed with these, it's almost like megalomania, but to a larger degree. Somebody who's obsessed with delusional fantasies of their own prestige, of their own power and their own grandeur. And this is, and a part of what goes along with the God complex, although it's not necessitated by somebody who has a God complex, is that, or at least the twist that we see here, is that Walter White, in addition to having a God complex, looks like he has some sociopathic tendencies as well. I mean, I'm almost certain of this. And the reason why I say that is because one of the things that characterizes a sociopath is an inability to create deep, intimate connections and empathetic relationships with other people. And besides his children, Walter White just simply doesn't have that. I mean, you can look at all of the secondary characters, even some of the recurring main characters in this series, and none of them, with, it's not with a single one of these characters does Walter White have any sort of deep, meaningful, or empathetic relationship with them. Not a single character. And the character who he does have a sort of intimate relationship with, which are his children, even his own children, he sort of treats them as objects of his own vanity and his own obsession, which we can see in his sort of compulsive obsession with wanting to protect them and wanting to defend them. And even in that sense, he treats them as objects that could be used to sort of build up his own fantasies of his own power. So the episode starts with Walter White at a car dealership, and apparently he's getting his car fixed, or his car is just getting out of the shop. He's going to pick it up. It's just been fixed. And I don't quite remember what happened in the fourth season, or if this, his car being messed up, is related to what happened in the fourth season. If I could be wrong about this, but I think his car got messed up when he ran over those drug dealers. But I can't quite be sure. I can't remember. But in any event, what happens is that Walter White winds up selling his car to the car dealership for $50. For $50, he sells his car to the car dealership. And after that, he goes out and he buys both himself and Walter Jr. new cars. And it's not like, these are sort of used cars. They look like they're brand new cars. And I'm not a car aficionado. I don't know anything about cars, but those look like some nice cars. And what's interesting to me is that this, you would think that if a person was on the outside looking in at this sort of behavior, they would think it's a little bit fishy, given the fact that, and I could be wrong about this, but I believe that Skylar said that Hank's treatment costs $600,000. I think that's how much it costs. And on top of that, they bought a car dealership, and they've been paying for Walter's cancer treatment. So from the outside looking in, I would think that somebody would look at this and think, this is kind of fishy. But in any event, we see how this, the act of Walter White buying himself and his son a car, is just again another allusion to how Walter views himself with respect to other people. Again, the car becomes an object. It becomes a symbol of his own vanity and his own power. And this becomes particularly striking given the fact that one of the main reasons why Walter cites for doing what he does is that he wants to protect his family, that he won't be there forever. Eventually he'll die, and he wants his family to have a security blanket. But if that's true, then why is he buying two new cars? I mean, if a person was really interested in providing their family with a security blanket, then maybe they would save their money rather than buying two brand new cars. So again, you can see how even when Walter claims that he's doing something for his children or for his family, what he's really doing is he has an ulterior motive, which is just building up his own fantasies of vanity and power. So, like I alluded to before, one of the major plot points in this episode was the growing antagonism, which really came to a head in this episode between Walter White and Skylar White. And in some sense, although I am very, very sympathetic for Skylar White, in some sense, she's partially responsible for what's happened to her. I mean, she's partially responsible for this situation in which she now finds herself. First, because she enabled Walter White by by coming up with a scheme to allow him to launder this money. So she enabled Walter White's behavior. And on top of that, by laundering his money, she's now become directly complicit in his criminal activity. And she mentions this a little bit in this episode where she turns to Walter and says, I there's no way I can get rid of you. I can't even go to the police because I'm complicit in this sort of criminal enterprise. And by doing this, by enabling Walter White's behavior and by becoming directly complicit in his criminal activities, what she's done is she's given Walter one more reason to think that he's powerful, that one more reason to believe in his own vanity. Because if she had put her foot down when she flipped the coin, when she flipped the coin and it was allusion to the fact that she might leave Walter, if she put her foot down, then she would not have been partially responsible for feeding into Walter White's own delusions about himself. And so that's why I think she's at least partially responsible. But even though I think she's partially responsible for this situation, I'm still very, very sympathetic towards her, and this is why I'm really rooting for her as against Walter White, because I agree with her. This is a completely it's a crazy environment. I mean, her children are have been put in danger by Walter White's criminal activity, and the fact that you can't, no one can claim that what's best for a child, especially a newborn child, is that their parents be implicated in dealing drugs. I mean, just no one can, no one can really believe that. And what was especially interesting to me, or what was rather very, very incredulous to me, was when at the beginning of this episode, Skylar talks about how maybe Walter Jr. should be sent to northern Arizona, and she's sort of making an allusion to the fact that this environment isn't safe for the children. And Walter White responds by saying, "What's wrong with our environment?" I mean, this is when you know that a character has just been feeding into their own delusions and is now very, very committed to their own delusions. Because any rational human being would say, obviously, this isn't in any sort of productive environment for a child to be in. And yet we have Walter saying, what's wrong with this environment? I don't see anything wrong with this." And so what's basically happened to Skylar is that she's a hostage within her own family. She's a hostage. And this is what both physical and psychological and emotional abuse, I guess that's three things, consist in. It consists in being a hostage to another person's emotional needs, to their physical needs, to their psychological needs. And Walter White has one of the classic profiles of an emotional and a psychological abuser, and in some sense a physical abuser. Because let's not forget the time that he almost raped Skylar. And what really was the climax of this episode, if you can call it that, is that there's one point in the episode where it's Walter White's birthday. It's the looks like it's evening at nighttime, sometime during the night. And Marie's there, Hank's there, Skylar's there, Walter's there. They're all there to obviously celebrate his birthday. And Walter is talking to Hank and Marie, and in the background you see Skylar walking into the pool. And she's sort of like, I think she was pretending. I'm almost certain she was pretending, but she was looked like she was in this catatonic state. And finally she just walks into the pool and drops down, and it looks like she's trying to kill herself. And then Walter has to jump in the pool and save her. And I'm almost certain that she wasn't seriously attempting to commit suicide, because after this event transpires, we see that what she was really attempting to do was to use this sort of fake attempted suicide as a pretext to have the children stay with Hank and Maria. And this was her way of basically trying to get the children, Walter and I actually don't remember the baby girl's name, but to get Walter and the baby daughter basically away from Walter. And and I think she was sort of pushed in this direction because, and again, this is very, very, I just love the cinematography of Breaking Bad, because you see the camera is directly on Walter White. But in the background, behind Walter, you see Skylar White, and you see her sort of contemplating about whether or not she should go in the pool. I think that's what she was doing. But I think that what really caused her to sort of snap in this way is the fact that while the attention is all on Walter White, the camera is on Walter, Hank and Marie are listening to Walter White speak, that she couldn't sit by and watch Walter be sort of glorified and celebrated in such a way when she knows the truth. She knows the reality. She knows who the real Walter White is. And so I think that was one of the major causes for her not sort of snapping in this way, but yeah, sort of snapping in this way, thinking that the only way she could get get some control over the situation is to pretend to attempt to kill herself. And so, what does it mean when I say that Skylar is basically a hostage in her own family? Well, everybody now thinks she's crazy. And Marie told Hank about Skylar's infidelity. So now both Marie and Hank believe that she's not only crazy, but that part of the reason for her craziness is that she's was because of her infidelity with Ted Beneke. And so Walter White has sort of created this emotional and psychological prison for her by manipulating everyone against her. I mean, he's certainly got Walter Jr. in his pocket, and now he's got Hank and Marie. And so that's what I mean when I say that Skylar is basically being kept hostage by Walter. And so when after all of this transpires, when Hank and Marie leave after the fake suicide attempt, Walter comes up to Skylar and he basically wants to know what her end game is. And Skylar tells him that her end game is to keep the children away from him as long as possible. And of course, Walter, being the sort of megalomaniac that he is, and the sort of obsession that he has with his children, can't stand for this. So he tells her that, well, the next time you try and pull something like this, maybe I'll have you committed in a psychiatric institution. And I'm just like, wow. Wow. He would have his wife committed to a psychiatric institution. The mother of his children. And then Skylar responds by saying, well, maybe I'll show up with a black eye, or maybe I'll have bruises on myself, and maybe I'll tell the police that you're abusing me. And then Walter goes ahead and points out several reasons why this scenario would never work. And then Skylar finally breaks down and says, well, I'm a coward. I don't know what I'm supposed to do in this situation. I just know that I have to keep you away from the children. And the only real thing that I can do is wait for the cancer to come back and wait for you to die. And I was thinking, first of all, that is just crazy. Like, wow. Skylar is just waiting for the cancer to come back for Walter to die. That's number one. But number two is, I was thinking to myself, well, the cancer is already back, and the name of the cancer is Walter White. Because as I said before, Walter is definitely the villain of this series. That's what this series is basically come down to. And Walter White's cancer basically made him a monster. Because if you remember, before the cancer, Walter was just a high school teacher, a high school chemistry teacher. And the cancer was a major catalyst for this story. Without the cancer, this story couldn't be possible. And so, like I alluded to in my last episode review, a big part of this story is the symbolic power of cancer. Of the cancer that's not just going to kill Walter White, which I expected to do at the end of the season, or expects Walter to be killed in some way at the end of this season. But the way in which Walter has become a sort of social cancer, the way in which he's become a cancer. And so, and the way this cancer manifests itself is through Walter White's narcissism, through his sort of sociopathic despotism, and through his God complex. And one of the ways that you can very clearly see this is in one of the closing scenes of this episode. Walter walks into the house and he points to a watch that he's been given by Jesse, and he tells his wife, "Look at this watch. The person who gave me this watch wanted to kill me, and he changed his mind, and you will too." And that's when you know that Walter is crazy and that he's firmly committed to his own delusions. And the other part of this episode was just dealing with, like I said before, the continuing criminal investigation by Hank into the remnants of Gus's operation. And in this episode, we see Hank pay a visit to Lydia, although at this point in time, it's rather clear that Hank doesn't know about Lydia's direct involvement in that criminal operation, because when he pays a visit to where Lydia works, he comes to arrest somebody else, not Lydia. And so what we see is that Hank, and as well as the DEA, is just continuing to crack down on all of the remnants of Gus's operation, continuing to squeeze people and arrest people. And what's very, very interesting is that Hank suspects that there's something more to this picture, but he can't quite put his finger on it. And he can't quite clearly see the whole entire picture. And what's really, really interesting to me about Hank, given the fact that Hank has been a part of a major subplot throughout this series, which is the sort of dramatic irony in the fact that the person who Hank is investigating, is Walter, his brother-in-law, but he doesn't know that, obviously. But my suspicion is that since we are at the end, we're in, the fifth and final season. My speculations about the role that Hank will play is that at some point, Hank will have a major role to play in exposing Walter White's criminal enterprise. That's my speculation, or sort of prediction, if you want to see it that way. And in addition to that, Hank gets some new job offer, and I can't remember who offered him the job, but he did get some new job offer, and he decided to take it. So, and one of the other things that deals with this sort of criminal investigation, or at least the criminal aspects of Walter White's double life, is that we see that Lydia is a little bit off kilter, because there's this whole subplot about how she planted a tracker on one of the methylamine barrels to make it seem like the cops were on to them, in order to be left alone by Mike and Walter and Jesse. And Mike wants to kill her because he thinks she's just a lunatic, and at some point she'll crack and she's a liability to their ongoing criminal enterprise. So he wants to kill her. And then but Jesse's was opposed to this. He didn't want Mike to kill her. And Jesse looks to Walter to back him up and being against Lydia being killed by Mike. And Walter says that the train won't stop. And what was very interesting about this is the way that we see precisely how much Jesse's has been manipulated by Walter. Because when Walter says the train won't stop, indicating that he's against Lydia being killed, Jesse interprets this to mean that Walter is not okay with Lydia being killed, when in reality it's quite clear from the viewer's perspective that it's not that Walter didn't want Lydia to be killed. It's that he's firmly committed to his into his criminal enterprise. And he sees Lydia's death as a liability, because if Lydia dies, then he doesn't have very easy access to methylamine. So it's not that he didn't want Lydia to be killed. but rather that he would see her death as an inconvenience. And again, this is just more evidence of Walter White's growing narcissism, because we all know that yes, the train isn't going to stop, but we know that the train isn't leading to paradise, but rather it's leading directly into a brick wall. And this was something that Mike alluded to in the first couple of episodes of this season, and he should have taken his own advice, but unfortunately he didn't. So as this final season is shaping up, very, very good episode. Another good episode. Very, very good fifth season so far. And I'm really loving the fact that we're getting a full exploration of the arc of character development of a multitude of characters in Walter White, Skyler, Mike, Jesse, and I'm so far I'm just really, really loving the character development of this fifth season. Although I expect as we move forward, especially as we close in on the eighth and final episode of this year until Breaking Bad comes back next year in 2013, I fully expect that the plot side of the narrative will ramp up to meet the character side of the narrative. So this was your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga. Just brought you another video with no frills, just the analysis. Peace and have a blessed day.